All right, so today we're diving deep into something pretty heavy. It's a lawsuit you might have heard of, Texas v. Becerra,
Yeah.
and what it could mean for disability rights here in America.
Oh, absolutely.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at an article called Posiwid, The Assault on Section 504 and the True Purpose of American Governance
Okay.
by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD.
Interesting.
Oh, no, what's really cool about this article is that the author is a trans and autistic teacher, so we're getting like a really personal perspective on this complex legal battle.
Right. Yeah. And that personal perspective, I think, is so important because it helps to kind of ground what could otherwise be a very abstract and frankly, a little bit intimidating legal discussion.
Yeah, no, totally. And it also makes it just so much more real, when you're hearing it from somebody who's actually living with a disability and could be directly impacted by the outcome of this lawsuit.
Absolutely.
So, okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the lawsuit itself, can you just give us a quick reminder about what Section 504 is and why it's such a big deal?
Sure. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it was a landmark piece of legislation because it was the first federal law to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in any program or activity receiving federal funding.
That's huge.
Yeah, it was massive. This means like schools, universities, workplaces, transportation, all sorts of things. And it essentially said you can't exclude people with disabilities just because they have a disability.
It's like finally acknowledging basic human rights.
Exactly, yeah. It was about recognizing that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else, and it paved a way for so many other important laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay, so Section 504, the foundation of so many protections. Now let's talk about Texas v. Becerra and how it's shaking things up.
So in a nutshell, this lawsuit was filed by 17 Republican attorneys general.
17?
17, yeah, it's a big one. And they're arguing that the Biden administration overstepped its bounds by including gender dysphoria under Section 504 protections.
And their argument is that it's not explicitly named in the law.
Yeah, that's their main sticking point. But what Hoerricks argues, and I think this is really important, is that this lawsuit isn't just about gender dysphoria. It's about using trans rights and a wedge issue to chip away at protections for all disabled people.
Me, that's a really good point.
Right, and the way they're doing that is by pushing for a very, very narrow interpretation of the law. For decades, Section 504 has been interpreted based on how a disability functionally impacts a person's life, not whether it's specifically listed.
Yeah, you don't need a checklist to prove you're struggling.
Exactly. And if this lawsuit succeeds, it could set a really dangerous precedent for all sorts of disabilities.
Right, and that's where Hoerricks' personal experience with erythromelalgia comes in.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
This is a rare condition that causes like burning pain, and it's not specifically named in Section 504, but it's still covered because of how it impacts their life.
Right, and that's how the law has always worked. It's about the functional impact, not the specific diagnosis.
So, like, if the court starts saying, well, it has to be listed in the law to be protected, then suddenly all these people with conditions like erythromelalgia, autism, ADHD, PTSD, they could lose those protections.
Absolutely. It would be a nightmare scenario for so many people.
It feels like going backwards, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like trying to stuff the genie back in the bottle after it's been out for decades and doing so much good.
And Hoerricks makes another really interesting point in their article about how this lawsuit fits into like a larger historical pattern of power dynamics in the U.S.
Yes, the historical context is crucial here.
Like, is this just another example of the government resisting progress?
Well, Hoerricks draws these parallels to, like, women's suffrage and the treatment of Chinese immigrants and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow.
Wow, yeah.
It's this pattern of those in power resisting equality, resisting change.
It's almost like history repeating itself in a way.
Exactly, and it shows that the fight for disability rights isn't happening in isolation. It's part of this much broader struggle for social justice.
So this case, it's not just a legal battle. It's a reflection of these deep-seated power structures in our society.
That's right, and that's why it's so important to understand the broader implications of what's happening here.
Because it could have ripple effects far beyond just this one lawsuit.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got the historical context, we've got the legal arguments. Now let's talk about what this actually means for people on the ground, specifically students who rely on 504 plans in schools.
Okay, so 504 plans, these are incredibly important for students with disabilities. They ensure things like accommodations, extra time on tests, preferential seating assistive technology, whatever that student needs to succeed.
It's about leveling the playing field.
Exactly, yeah. And if this court case goes the wrong way, these 504 plans could be severely weakened or even dismantled.
Seriously.
Yeah, and the impact would be devastating. Imagine students with dyslexia or anxiety suddenly losing the support they need to thrive in school.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
And remember, Hoerricks is a teacher, so they see this firsthand. They see how crucial these 504 plans are for their students.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about legal theory, but it's another thing entirely to see how it impacts real people's lives.
Right, and that's what makes this lawsuit so concerning, because it's not just about abstract legal principles, it's about the lives and well-being of countless students across the country.
So what we're talking about here is a potential massive setback for students with disabilities if this lawsuit goes the wrong way.
It's a very real possibility, and that's why it's so important for people to understand the stakes involved here.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has gone from a seemingly narrow lawsuit about gender dysphoria to this much larger conversation about the future of disability rights in America.
That's the thing about these seemingly isolated issues. They often reveal these deeper systemic problems.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly, and the more we understand those deeper layers, the better equipped we are to address them.
And speaking of deeper layers, Hoerricks ends their article with this powerful call for solidarity.
Yes, that's such an important point.
Not just within the disability community, but among all marginalized groups.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of our struggles and understanding that an attack on one group is an attack on all of us.
So it's about building bridges, creating alliances, recognizing that we're stronger together.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this deep dive so important, because it's not just about analyzing a legal case. It's about exploring the deeper systems at play and the urgent need for collective action.
And with that in mind, I think it's time to dive deeper into that call for solidarity and what it actually looks like in practice.
Sounds good to me.
So let's take a quick pause and come back to that after the break.
All right?
Okay, so we're back and ready to unpack this whole idea of solidarity, because it's one thing to say, like, we should all work together, but it's a whole other thing to actually, like, put it into practice.
Yeah, totally. And I think it starts with really understanding, like, how all of these seemingly separate issues, right? Trans rights, disability rights, racial justice, all of it, they're actually, like, deeply interconnected.
Okay, so we're not just talking about random acts of kindness here. We're talking about recognizing a shared struggle.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about seeing those connections and understanding that it's all part of this, like, same underlying system of oppression.
So instead of getting caught up in these, like, individual identity categories, we need to see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And Hoerricks argues that that's how we can start building a more unified movement for change.
Okay, I like that. So how do we actually do that, though? Like, are we talking massive protests in the streets? Are there more, like, subtle, everyday ways to practice solidarity?
Honestly, it can be both and everything in between. It can mean showing up for protests and rallies organized by different groups, even if they don't directly impact you.
Okay, so stepping outside of our comfort zones.
Yeah, exactly. And it can also mean like donating to organizations fighting for various social justice causes, or even just like amplifying the voices of marginalized communities on social media.
So using whatever platform you have to support those who are fighting for justice?
Exactly. Yeah, it's about recognizing that like we're all in this together. Our liberation is bound up with each other.
And it sounds like this goes way beyond just like performative allyship, right? It's about doing the deeper work of understanding how systems of oppression actually operate.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's not enough to just like slap a rainbow sticker on your laptop and call it a day.
Right.
It's about educating yourself, challenging your own biases, and really being willing to listen and learn from others.
And then taking action based on what you've learned?
Right, exactly. It's not just about saying like, oh, I'm an ally. It's about actually using your privilege to advocate for those who are less privileged, to amplify their voices, and to challenge those in power.
Okay, so it sounds like solidarity is like an ongoing process, a commitment to showing up consistently, even when it's like uncomfortable or inconvenient.
Yeah, that's true. It's not always easy, but it's so essential if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture of solidarity, but let's bring it back to this specific case. Hoerricks talks about the impact this lawsuit could have on 504 plans in schools. How can we show solidarity with students with disabilities, particularly those who might be like most vulnerable if these plans are weakened?
Okay, well, I think a good place to start is by like educating ourselves about like what 504 plans are and how they support students with like a wide range of disabilities.
So understanding the issue and then like spreading the word, talking to our families, communities.
Exactly, yeah. And we can also contact our elected officials, urge them to protect the rights of students with disabilities.
Right, make our voices heard.
And we can support organizations that advocate for inclusive education.
Okay, so there's like a lot of different avenues we can explore.
And then within our own schools and communities, I think it's so important to listen to the concerns of students with disabilities, advocate for their needs, really make them feel seen and heard.
So it's about like shifting the culture, not just focusing on legal battles or policy changes.
Yeah, for sure, because true solidarity requires us to like change the way we think and talk about disability, and create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Wow. Okay, so this conversation has really taken us on a journey from this specific legal case to this much broader discussion about solidarity and systemic change.
And it all comes back to that fundamental question that Hoerricks poses in their article, the whole POSI-WIT thing.
Oh, yeah, what was that again? I remember it was an acronym.
Yeah, it stands for the purpose of society is what it decides.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Right. It's a challenge to really think critically about the values that our society is built on.
So if this lawsuit succeeds and Section 504 is weakened, what does that say about the purpose of American governance?
That's the question that Hoerricks wants us to grapple with. It forces us to confront whether our society truly values inclusion, equity, the rights of all its members, or if it's just paying lip service to those ideas.
Yeah, it's a question we all need to sit with.
Absolutely. And it should inform our actions, our choices, and our commitment to building a better world.
Okay, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but also inspired.
That's good. That's a good place to be, I think.
Because we've gone from feeling like helpless bystanders to recognizing that we actually have power to make a difference.
Exactly. Recognizing our own agency, that's where it all begins.
So this deep dive hasn't just been about understanding a lawsuit. It's been about understanding ourselves, our values, and our role in shaping the world around us.
Beautifully said.
And with that in mind, I think it's time to shift gears and talk about what action actually looks like, because understanding the problem is just the first step. The real work begins with doing something about it.
I couldn't agree more. Let's explore some concrete steps we can all take to turn this knowledge into action.
Okay, so we've talked about the lawsuit, the historical context, and that call for solidarity. But now let's get practical. What can we as individuals actually do to make a difference in this fight?
Well, I think one of the most important things is just raising awareness, talking about these issues, sharing Hoerricks' article, helping others understand what's at stake.
It's like that saying, knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. And it's not just about sharing information. It's about actively listening to disabled people, believing their experiences, and pushing back against those harmful narratives that try to divide us.
So being mindful of the language we use, being willing to educate ourselves, and being an ally in those everyday moments.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, solidarity isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing commitment to showing up for marginalized communities.
Okay, so beyond raising awareness, what are some concrete actions we can take to support disability rights and push back against this attack on Section 504?
Well, there are some amazing organizations out there doing incredible work like the ACLU, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, and so many more. Donating to them, volunteering your time, even just spreading the word about their work can make a real difference.
And something I think we often forget is the power of contacting our elected officials.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
It might seem old school, but letting them know that this is an issue we care about, that we expect them to fight for the rights of all their constituents, including disabled people, that can actually make a difference.
Absolutely. Our elected officials need to hear from us. They need to know that we're paying attention and that we're holding them accountable.
And sometimes it's the small things that can add up to big change, like being aware of ableist language and attitudes and gently challenging them when you encounter them. It's about creating those ripples of change in our own circles.
Exactly. Those everyday actions, those moments of speaking up and showing up can contribute to a larger cultural shift.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about winning legal battles. It's about changing hearts and minds.
I couldn't agree more. It's about creating a culture where disability is seen not as a deficit, but as a different way of being a valuable part of human diversity.
It's about moving beyond tolerance to genuine acceptance and inclusion.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to that powerful question Hoerricks asks. If this lawsuit succeeds, what does it tell us about whose interests are truly being protected?
It's a question that really makes you think, doesn't it? It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power privilege and who gets to define the purpose of our society.
And then that follow-up question, what can we do collectively to demand a system that values people over profit and inclusion over exclusion?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not enough to just understand the problem. We have to be actively engaged in building the solutions.
So listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with those questions to ponder. What does this lawsuit reveal about our society's values? And what actions, big or small, will you take to demand a more just and equitable world for all?
Remember, change starts with each one of us.
You can find more of Jaime Hoerricks' work over at the Outside publication. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight.